Welcome back to Stories from the Stead with your host, Alan Bishop, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest and lead distiller at Old Homestead Distillery in Birdseye, Indiana. Sit back, have a drink, and enjoy this story from our hearts and hearth to yours. So you may have noticed the images of the peach trees at the beginning of this video. Distilling is inherently agricultural. That is something that we as a society have unfortunately lost with the age of industrialization after the 1862 war. That agrarian lifestyle sort of faded off into the distance, and the last nail was really put into the coffin for the farm distillers by Prohibition, which wiped out an entire generation of distillers. Many unfortunate circumstances surrounding that, including the formation of what would become KKK and their hatred of drinking, with the idea that it was destroying the quote-unquote white culture. Plants tell stories, just like humans do. Sometimes the plants know more of the story than what the humans do, whether they be long-lived plants or they be seed passed down from generation to generation to generation. Seed that's well taken care of doesn't drift off of where it came from as much as oral tradition does, like a game of telephone. For me, distillation is sacred. Distillation is something that I absolutely, positively love, adore, and practice daily. To be able to capture the quintessence of an heirloom plant is to be able to capture the quintessence of a time and place that no longer exists. Not only the fruit, as it were, ripe in season as you're standing under the tree and harvesting it, to be able to experience that in the depths of winter when it's needed most, but also the quintessence of the people who brought those plants to the place where they exist and who cultivated those plants for generations. No plant is quite more emblematic of the history of the Black Forest of southern Indiana, the distilling region made up of Washington, Orange, Lawrence, Crawford, Harrison, and Perry counties, than the Fleenor peach. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the Fleenor peach. But understand that this peach is legendary. It's actually currently being considered for nomination into the Slow Food Ark of Taste by David Shields. To me, that is amazing. That's a huge part of our Hoosier heritage, a part of our southern Indiana foodways to be preserved for generations yet to come. First heard about this peach maybe 15 years ago when I was researching distillation. I heard that the Fleenors had brought a peach here specifically for the art of distillation, and that peach still grew in this county in the area where Mr. Fleenor had his still house. After researching it, I found a grove of those peaches, and I was able to gather seed from them and bring them back home and propagate them on my farm here in Pekin, Indiana. I have several now surrounding my house. It's always best to live in your garden if you possibly can. There's several on our farm as well. We actually found groves of these peaches all over the 6-county region and outside of the 6-county region. They're a landrace variety peach, a white cleanstone peach that comes true from seed and always has. It had its own unique management program, which consisted of farmers plowing off a field as though they were going to plant a commercial crop, seed crop, planting the seeds on 20-foot centers, letting them begin their germination process over the winter into the spring, plowing the field next to them, laying out another field, and doing this on a 7 to 12 year cycle. The peaches, the trees themselves, don't get huge, they're easy to manage, and they're not very long lived. 7 to 12 years is about their productive life cycle in general, maybe a little longer from time to time, but 7 to 12 is the traditional agrarian southern Hoosier way of taking care of these peaches. And so after that time period, the farmers would go in, they'd cut the trees down, and then they'd have wood for their still house to make more peach brandy. This peach became the predominant Midwestern variety for nurseries and for orchards. There was an orchard once in Livonia, Indiana that had thousands of these trees. And the ridges above the Ohio River Valley were home to millions of these peaches, all feeding an industry of fruit distillers here in southern Indiana. It would be hard to put your finger on anything more distinctly Southern Hoosier than this peach variety. Its ability to survive at long abandoned still sites that have not been developed as a sort of weed growing amongst fence rows or in cemeteries even where I found some. A reminder of a past that enemies of distillers tried to erase. A reminder of one Johannes Fleenor, who we're going to talk about now. Just a few more notes on our peach real quick. So the Fleenor peach actually became the primary nursery peach for almost the entirety of the upper Midwest throughout the late 1800s. There are newspaper articles and nursery catalogs listing the peach and its dripping honey succulency advertisements out there. The peach also was grown all over the high ridges above the Ohio River Valley, where it was rarely affected by frost or pests. I only know of one instance where the peach failed at a distillery, and trust me, pretty much every distillery in the six-county region had a grove of these peaches, which is why they still linger around those old sites. You can't find a furnace or any foundations. If you find those peaches, you probably found an old still site. I've even seen hills, what look like hills or mounds of dirt, that once you dig into them, turn out to be nothing but peach bits, the same size and shape as Fleenor's, that had been dumped out the distillery door after distillation. As well, there was an orchard in Livonia, Indiana that was nothing but several thousand of these Fleenor peach trees that was feeding the distilleries of Stampers Creek Township and eastern Orange County. Two of those old 7th District distilleries, the Wolf and the McCoy, we've actually gathered yeast from as well. But enough about the peach for the moment. Let's dive into the story of Johannes Fleenor. So Johannes Fleenor was born on January 31st, 1760 in Frederick County, Maryland, to Nicholas, who himself was a distiller of fruit brandies of some great renown, and Maria Katharina Fulkerson. John was of German ancestry on his father's side, and Norwegian, Dutch, and French on his mother's side. You could say that he had distillation running through his veins. In the 1770s, the family moved to Virginia with John's siblings, including Abraham, the one who actually brought the bare root stock and seed of the Fleenor peach to this place in Washington County, Indiana. In Virginia, John married the first of what would become 3 wives, Elizabeth Hensley, in 1789. They were the parents of 8 children. Around 1800, John and Elizabeth followed the Wilderness Trail with Micajah Calloway and potentially Squire Boone. Micajah Calloway himself, an undersung Hoosier hero, was actually a forward scout for Daniel Boone and brought many of the early families here to Washington, Orange, and Harrison counties, and is buried not too far away from John. They came via the Cumberland Gap and lived for 3 years in Woodford County, Kentucky, another famous distilling region, 2 miles away from the Callaway plantation at that time. From 1806 to 1807, they lived for a short while in Jefferson County, Kentucky, site of present-day Louisville, Kentucky. In the fall of 1807, they settled in what was then known as Harrison County, Indiana, but would later be turned into Washington County, meaning John lived here 7 years prior to Washington County actually existing, and 9 years prior to Indiana's statehood. Alongside his pioneer friends, the Callaways, the Denneys, the Nichols, the Johnsons, and the Houses, they erected a fort for protection from local Native American tribes called Fleenor's Forts. When Elizabeth decided that the frontier life was not for her, John became the first man in the state of Indiana to ever file for divorce. I'm not sure that's a point of pride, but just an interesting note. Soon after arriving in Indiana, John set up the first still house that we could prove here in Washington County, relying on rye and locally grown fruit to feed his still. Using local blackberries, pawpaws, and anything that grew within the wilderness, as well as later the famous Fleenor peach once orchards were established. The rye distilling didn't last long, even if those with German ancestry would have wished it had, because the old varieties would grow to 7 or 8 feet tall sometimes. but they would ripen in June, when here in southern Indiana we still get some heavy torrential downpours and windstorms for 5 to 10 minutes at a time. This would lay the crop flat and rot it in the field before anything could be done with it. Luckily, however, as we mentioned, John's brother Abraham came to the rescue with the Fleenor peach. One more tidbit on that Fleenor peach. If you're wondering where that peach would have come from originally, the Spanish brought peaches with them when they came to the New World. And by the time Europeans came in to create the colonies of the East Coast, it was said in many of the old eastern colonies that if you cut down a pine grove, within 6 months you would have all kinds of weedy, clingstone type peaches that were great for distilling. It's likely that back in Virginia, John and Abraham, or perhaps their father, had found this particular white clingstone and used it for distillation in that state, understanding its value as an agricultural and distillation crop, making it worthwhile to bring here to the Indiana frontier. The peaches were gathered in August and September of every year. They were taken whole and either run through what was known as a nut mill, allowing some of these stones to be broken and enter into the fruit mash brandy, which would essentially consist of both the peach mash itself as well as boiled limestone water. Or they were simply thrown into the barrels and allowed to naturally break down and ferment of their own accord, sometimes lingering in the barrels until the cold months of the year when fermentation would stop and or stall, waiting till next spring until it kicked back in and finished up before distilling, much like traditional Palinka style distillation or Slivovitsia style distillation. The process was almost always double pot distilled, although stills with retorts and or what you might nowadays call thumpers were also common here within the Black Forest in the early days. That isn't all John had going for him. He mustered into Captain Hargraves' company of Indiana Militia September 18th through November 19th of 1811, and served with William Henry Harrison, himself also a Hoosier distiller, at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Afterwards, he would hold his muster day celebrations and trainings at his homestead, complete with a cask of old rye or old peach brandy, with the head knocked out and a dipping cup for all to partake of. You see, drinking then was not frowned upon, and it's said that the old-timers had whiskeys and brandies of such pure quality that they did not cause the violence and mistakes of modern-day drinking. John, like many distillers of his day, was also a church deacon. In 1814, John married Mary Grissamore and had as many as 10 children. Mary died tragically in 1831. Shortly thereafter, John married again to Rebecca Portoff and had 8 more children. See, you can tell that there's a trend here. Not a whole lot going on in those days at home, I'd say. It's known that at least 24 of those children lived to adulthood, with 2 of them living to be a century plus old, 1 daughter and 1 son, at 102 and 105 years old, likely due to that pioneer lifestyle and quality brandy. John himself lived to be 93 years old. In a newspaper advertisement that John took out in Salem, Indiana, and Scottsburg, Indiana, he advertised that any man in the frontier that had more children than he did, he would love to meet, and he would gladly reward if they brought a wagon along with them, with all the provisions they might need for the winter that could be loaded onto that wagon. When a gentleman from Scottsburg, Indiana turned up having more children than he did, John didn't wince at it. He congratulated the man, loaded up his wagon, and threw 2 extra bags of corn onto the horse for good measure. That's what you call good people. That's what you call good Hoosiers. John is buried at Nicholson Cemetery, and to him, we drank old peach and honey, and we toast the foundations of the Black Forest of southern Indiana, the old 7th District. From our hearts and hearts to yours, love y'all.